G'day, welcome to another episode of the Pier Review. You might have watched one of my previous videos, the teaser episode for Series 2 of The Right Stuff, in which I explored the activities of my great-great-great-grandfather, Samuel Wright II, and his sad participation, or sad to us at least, in the anti-Chinese riots at Buckland in 1857 and Lambing Flat in 1861 on the gold rushes. I released that video the 2 days before Australia Day to deliberately provoke some reaction from people participating in events such as March for Australia. Under one of my Twitter or X aliases, I posted it on a number of feeds of, let's just say, right-wing anti-immigrationists, or we could say racists. And I got not that much of a response. I was actually quite disappointed. So I thought I would actually explore the issues a little bit further, because it seems that we have two versions of history in Australia. Now recently, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott has written a book entitled Australia, A History, and it's recently been made into a TV series by Sky News. So I'm going to examine that in the context of how we perceive history today and how it seems to divide Australia. Now, Tony Abbott is a former Rhodes Scholar with degrees in economics and politics. And normally I'd say that any mug standing on a pier can actually review it. You don't need any qualifications whatsoever. But I actually have a double major in history, including specialisation in historiography. So in this case, I'm not a mug standing on a pier. I actually sort of know what I'm talking about. So, what does Tony Abbott say his aim is in writing and screening this history?
Let's learn the right lessons from the past and make the most of what we have.
But what are the right lessons? And what, therefore, are the wrong lessons? And from what version of the past, or what historiography, the history of history, does Tony want us to learn from? Tony states that we Australians are
A country with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. It's a great story, but not enough of us know it.
So, to examine his history, let's follow him.
Let's go back to the beginning.
Tony begins by looking at the relationship between the British colonists and the Indigenous Australians. He starts by making it clear that after the arrival of the British in Sydney in 1788, that despite
the clash of two very different cultures,
the relationship between the two was actually quite harmonic. But when the frontier starts to expand, that starts to change, and conflict arose. And to illustrate this, he focuses closely on Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land.
it was in the very early 1800s that the colony then called Van Diemen's Land was established first at Hobart and then at Launceston. That was really the first place where the settlers and the first Australians came into serious conflict.
Tony Abbott makes it clear that his preference is not to refer to the conflict between the colonists and the Aboriginal Australians as a war.
What's your thought about what contemporary historiography tends to call the frontier wars, but that I would prefer to call frontier conflict?
And his historian backs him up. Tony focuses on Van Diemen's Land, opening with the famous "treat everyone the same" signs which were displayed around the frontier. But how did the white people act in Tasmania in the 1820s and 1830s? And did they think it was a war? And for this, I'll be referencing some contemporary historical records, mainly gained from works including Nicholas Clement's book, The Black War, and Henry Reynolds' work, The Forgotten War, but also direct primary sources from places like Tasmanian State Archives. Now, Henry Melville was a journalist at the time in 1831, and he wrote that during the months of September, October and November, the Black War, and nothing but the Black War, was the subject of general attention. And Henry Emmett, who participated in the war, refers to the Black War in his recollection, written later in the 1870s. One argument often used as to why it was not a war is that the Aboriginal Australians were subjects of the Crown. So therefore, any armed conflict between fellow subjects of the Crown, the Indigenous Australians and the colonising British, does not fit the definition of a war, which is between two separate nations. And while Secretary of the State for the Colonies, Lord Glenelg, instructed in 1835 that the Aborigines were protected by the law and could not be considered as aliens with whom a war can exist and against whom Her Majesty's troops can exercise belligerent right. But looking at it from the point of the Aboriginal Australians, they were hardly likely to see themselves as subjects of the King. They were repelling invaders. And it's interesting now that the official term for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is First Nations, implying that they had the status of a sovereign state. But in any case, Glenelg's instruction was a little bit late, because not only had the Tasmanian Black War concluded 4 years earlier, but that in 1825, Glenelg's predecessor, Lord Bathurst, had given orders to the colonial governors, including George Arthur in Van Diemen's Land, that they were to understand it to be your duty, when such disturbances cannot be prevented or allayed by less vigorous measures, to oppose force by force and repel such aggression in the same manner as if they proceeded from the subjects of any accredited state. And how did the Van Diemen's Land administration take that instruction? Well, when the Colonial Solicitor General declined to charge a colonist for killing a native, he justified this by referring to the Aboriginal Tasmanians as open enemies of the King in a state of actual warfare against him. Now, while the argument that Aboriginal people were subjects of the Crown and therefore the conflict was not a war has been used by some, including at one time the Australian War Memorial, to determine that the conflict was not a war, that is not the argument used in Tony Abbott's History of Australia. Tony's pet historian Alex McDermott says,
"My view is to have a war, to have a frontier war, you need the established government of the nation or the state to declare it and to conduct it and to drive it. And that's not what happened in Australia."
He says that the violence was just carried out by the settlers on the frontier and not formally by the government. So we're standing here in Franklin Square, which is where the location of the original government house of Van Diemen's Land was. So let's look again to Van Diemen's Land. On the 1st of November 1829, in response to increasing attacks by native Tasmanians upon the colonial settlers, Governor George Arthur issued a proclamation equivalent to an executive order of government. It's worth considering this in its entirety.
Whereas the black or Aboriginal natives of this island have for a considerable time past carried on a series of indiscriminate attacks upon the persons and property of diverse of His Majesty's subjects, and have especially of late perpetrated most cruel and sanguinary acts of violence and outrage, evincing an evident disposition systematically to kill and destroy the white inhabitants indiscriminately whenever an opportunity of doing so is presented. And whereas, notwithstanding the proclamation made and issued by me on the 15th day of April, last past, and that every practicable measure has from time to time been resorted to, under that proclamation, and otherwise, for the purpose of removing the Aboriginals from the settled districts of the colony, and for putting a stop to the repetition of such atrocities, repeated inroads are daily made by the natives into the said settled districts, and acts of hostility and barbarity there committed by them, as well as at the more distant stock runs, and in some instances upon unoffending and defenceless women and children. And whereas also, it seems, at present, impossible to conciliate the several tribes of that people, and the ordinary civil powers of the magistrates, and the means afforded by the common law, are found by experience to be wholly insufficient for the general safety, and it hath therefore become at length unavoidably necessary, for the effectual suppression of similar enormities, to proclaim and keep in force martial law, in the manner hereinafter proclaimed and directed. Now therefore, by virtue of the powers and authorities in me, in this behalf vested, I, the said Lieutenant Governor, do by these presents, declare and proclaim, that from and after the date of this, my proclamation, and until the cessation of hostilities shall be by me hereafter proclaimed and directed martial law is and shall continue to be in force against the several black or aboriginal natives, within the several districts of this island.
He then goes on to list, in some detail, the regions to which the proclamation applied, and then concludes,
and, for the purposes aforesaid, all soldiers are hereby required and commanded to obey and assist their lawful superiors, and all other His Majesty's subjects are required and commanded to obey and assist the magistrates in the execution of such measures as shall by any one or more of such magistrates be directed to be taken for those purposes, by such ways and means as shall by him or them be considered expedient, so long as martial law shall continue to exist. But, I do, nevertheless, hereby strictly order, enjoin, and command, that the actual use of arms be in no case resorted to, if the natives can by other means be induced or compelled to retire into the places and portions of this island herein before excepted from the operation of martial law, that bloodshed be checked, as much as possible, that any tribes which may surrender themselves up, shall be treated with every degree of humanity, and that defenceless women and children be invariably spared. And, all officers, civil and military, and others person whatsoever, are hereby required to take notice of this, my proclamation and order, and to render obedience and assistance herein accordingly. Provided nevertheless, and it is hereby notified and proclaimed, that nothing herein contained, shall, or doth extend to interrupt or interfere with the ordinary exercise of the civil power, or the regular course of the common law, any further or otherwise than as such interruption shall, for the purpose of carrying on military operations against the natives, be rendered necessary. Given under my hand and seal at arms, at the Government House, Hobart Town, this 1st day of November, 1828. George Arthur.
so if the use of the phrases cessation of hostilities and tribes which may surrender isn't enough to convince you that it was a war, then the phrases soldiers are hereby required and commanded, carrying on military operations against the natives, I, the said Lieutenant Governor, declare and proclaim martial law is and shall continue to be in force against the Aboriginal natives, it can only be seen in the context of an officially declared war. So, Alex McDermott says that to have a war, you need the established government to declare it and conduct it. Well, it's pretty clear that Governor Arthur's proclamation of 1 November 1829 was a declaration of war. So now let's look at the way the government of Van Diemen's Land conducted that war. The first strategy was to use a combination of military and paid civilian roving parties. These would roam the wild areas and kill as many Aboriginal people as they could find. One of those civilian roving parties, and remember these civilian roving parties were paid by the government, crept up onto a band of Tasmanian Aboriginal people about 2 kilometres from here, between Mathina and Mangana, in northeastern Tasmania on the eastern foothills of Ben Lomond, and executed 17 Aboriginal people as they were sleeping, and captured 10 others. And on the way back into the settled districts, 2 of them were so wounded that John Batman, who led the party, executed them in cold blood. John Batman came to fame sometimes later as the first settler of what is now the city of Melbourne. And he's remembered by Tony Abbott, more so in his book, about settling a treaty with the Aboriginal people. But he had a dark past before that. And in the year following the proclamation of martial law, there's evidence to estimate that at least 135 Aboriginal Tasmanians were killed in 29 incidents, in which 109 died in at least 10 multiple killings. So it might be a good time to go back to the sign that Tony uses to introduce his views on the Black War. The famous sign that he says showed fairness was applied by the government. Now, the example used in Tony Abbott's TV series is this one. It suggests that the signs were issued in 1816 by Governor Davey, but this is incorrect. The replica posters featuring that mistake were made for the Australasian Intercolonial exhibition held in Melbourne in 1866. And the racist anecdote at the bottom, which I won't read out, was added at that time. It's an interesting fact that the signs were actually issued some 14 years later by Governor Arthur, who ordered their distribution in 1830, after those 135 Aborigines had been killed in cold blood by the roving parties, and just before the biggest government organised military campaign of the Black War against the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. On September 11, 1830, Governor Arthur issued another proclamation.
The Lieutenant Governor has considered with anxious interest the numerous representations of the settlers, expressive of their alarm at the increasing boldness of the natives, and of the danger in which their lives and property will be placed, unless additional protection be speedily afforded by the government. The Lieutenant Governor, therefore, calls upon every settler to place himself under the direction of the police magistrate of the district in which his farm is situated, so that a sufficiently numerous volunteer force will thus be raised, that, in combination with the whole disposable strength of the military and police, and by one cordial and determined effort, will afford a good prospect of either capturing the whole of the hostile tribes, or of permanently expelling them from the settled districts. The utmost disposable military force will be stationed in a few days at those points in the interior which are most exposed to attack, or in which the natives are most likely to be encountered. The direction of the whole of the combined force thus employed is confided to the general charge of Major Douglas, 63rd Regiment, who is stationed at Oaklands as the most central point of communication. All minor objects must for a time give way to this one great and engrossing pursuit, and as the combined forces of the volunteers, the military, and the police will be sufficiently numerous almost immediately to ensure the perfect safety of a large portion of the interior. His Excellency directs that the general movement shall commence on Thursday the 7th of October next.
And if you need further confirmation that this was a declared military campaign by the government of Van Diemen's Land, then this map is officially entitled Field Plan of Movements of the Military No. 9, Military Operations Against the Aboriginal Inhabitants of Van Diemen's Land. On that same day, September 11, 1830, when he announced the Black Line, Governor Arthur also granted 2,000 acres of land to John Batman for leading one of those roving parties who had killed 17 Tasmanian Aboriginals just 1 year before. Batman owned land here in the Ben Lomond region. The property of Kingston was his original property, so we're assuming that the 2,000 acres of land were this land that you can see right here. While the operation known as the Black Line ultimately only captured one old man and a boy, the writing was on the wall for the Aboriginal Tasmanians, and many of them surrendered to George Augustus Robinson in September 1831. And in January 1832, the last of the warriors surrendered to the governor in Hobart. Under the protection of Robinson, the remaining Aboriginal people were sent to Flinders Island in Bass Strait. But that's not the end of the story, or of the proof that the conflict between the colonists and the Aboriginal Tasmanians was in fact officially a war. For in September 1831, two settlers, Thomas and Parker, were making their way from the Tamar River to their property near Northdown Beach, near the mouth of the Rubicon River. This was around the time of the surrender to Robinson. Due to the inclement weather, Thomas and Parker were unable to make it to their home further around the coast. So they pulled in here to Port Sorell, where one morning they were set upon and murdered by a number of Aboriginal people. An inquest was held, and the verdict was
that the deceased, Bartholomew Boyle Thomas and James Parker, have been treacherously murdered by the male natives now in custody, assisted by the residue of the tribe known by the name of the Big River Tribe, during the most friendly intercourse, whilst endeavouring to carry into effect the conciliatory measures recommended by the government.
So, what happened to the three Aboriginal men held in custody for the murder of Thomas and Parker? Well, a week later, the Launceston Advertiser received a letter from a correspondent named J.E., who wrote,
"The verdict of the coroner's jury has attributed the deaths of the late Captain Thomas and Mr. Parker to the male natives, who are now in custody, and to the rest of their tribe. The evidence adduced before the coroner is so conclusive on this head that there can be no doubt of those two gentlemen, whose loss we deplore, having been killed by these benighted and treacherous people. My feelings prompt me to wish the extermination of the blacks, but on a mature reflection on the subject some solemn questions present themselves. Are these unhappy creatures the subjects of our king, in a state of rebellion? Or are they an injured people, whom we have invaded and with whom we are at war? Are they within the reach of our laws, or are they to be judged by the law of nations? Are they to be viewed in the light of murderers, or as prisoners of war? Have they been guilty of any crime under the laws of nations which is punishable by death, or have they only been carrying on a war in their way? Are they British subjects at all, or a foreign enemy who has never yet been subdued, and which resists our usurped authority and dominion? Much as I am prejudiced against the savages, I cannot on principles of justice and humanity refrain from coming forward on this occasion as their advocate, to plead in their behalf, that they are not amenable to our laws, as they are ignorant of them, that they are not murderers under the laws of nations, having killed the white men while following upon a war in their own way, that they are therefore only prisoners of war."
The editor of the paper made a comment where he predicted what might happen.
"We give insertion to the foregoing, although far exceeding the limits generally allowed to correspondence, believing that the writer really felt what he has so charitably penned in defence of the native prisoners. However, the proclamation of the year 1829, we think, negatives the charge of murder. It is most probable that they will be placed on Fernoses Island."
So the government's martial law proclamation, officially declaring a war against the Aboriginal Tasmanians, was still in place, and the three Aboriginal men were shipped off to Flinders Island as prisoners of war. And that, Mr. Abbott and Mr. McDermott, is a declaration that this was not a conflict, but was in fact a war. One of Tony Abbott's recurring themes about what he calls the frontier conflicts is that the government, at least, had good intentions towards the Indigenous people. And he spends a large amount of time in the first episode discussing the Mile Creek massacre and its aftermath. Now, at least 28 Aboriginal people, mainly women, children and old men, were massacred by some white stockmen at Mile Creek. Now, the thing about the Mile Creek massacre is that almost uniquely among the colonial massacres of Indigenous people, the perpetrators were actually arrested and put on trial. And whilst there was a huge backlash from the community against that happening, many of them were actually hanged. And Tony Abbott says that that was
the first time that white people had been charged over the murder of black people, and it was ultimately the triumph of justice over racist brutality.
And so, We should celebrate the one instance of justice rather than commemorate or feel regret for the hundreds of examples of racist brutality. I mean, the theme sort of is because there are a few people doing good, we weren't all bad.
It wasn't systematic, it wasn't planned, it wasn't government authorised, and governors consistently, once conflict started to inevitably build, did everything they could to try and stop that.
So Tony's historian is saying it wasn't planned, it just happened, and the governments did everything they could to try and stop it. We'll contrast that to the recent Bondi massacre, where so many people said that despite all of our gun laws, and it being a one-off rather than a regularly occurring event, as the massacres of Indigenous Australians were, that the government did nothing to stop the Bondi massacre. And what did Tony Abbott say about that?
I think that what we've seen from all levels of government in this country since October the 7th is hand-wringing impotence in the face of example after example of Jew hatred.
So, Tony Abbott, Alex McDermott and the Australian War Memorial don't want us to remember this conflict as a war, when at the time the participants on both sides referred to it as just that. It was a government orchestrated military campaign. So why does Tony Abbott want to change the story? Why does he want to downplay it? Maybe because it's both modern Australia's foundation story and the worst horror story in our nation's history. But as Jacinta Price says,
and yes, let's talk about the terrible things that occurred. We are a remarkable country because of the way that our history has played out, and circumstances could have been a lot worse for Australia's first people had it been anyone else other than the British.
Oh well. So leaving the Black Wars here, it's time to conclude part one of the peer review of Tony Abbott's Australia, A History. So stay tuned for episode 2, where we'll be examining the gold rush and the influx of immigration into Australia from then until now. So if you've enjoyed this one, please click like, please subscribe. Hit me up in the comments below if you'd like to make any reflections on what the content we've covered off in this one. And yeah, we'll see you again on a pier to review part 2 of Tony Abbott's Australia, A History. Thanks for watching. And who is Alex McDermott? Well, he's the author of Australian History for Dummies. Yeah, don't be a dummy, eh, Tony?